This presentation is New Patreon Series 49C, Part 3, the HEKHALOT Practice of Later Jewish Descenders of the Merkaba. Now, in the HEKHALOT literature, which really runs from about the 2nd century all the way into the medieval period, we have an interesting terminology that's being used. Instead of talking about ascending to the HEKHALOT, or ascending to the Merkaba, or in the Merkaba, or ascending into the chariot. The term is used as descent to the chariot. And the people that go up, make the ascent, are called the descenders. And we want to explore that for quite a bit here because it indicates that basically people were going through a process that was a liturgical process in order to produce a trance, if possible, in order to go through the process of the ascent. And the descent is a way of describing the entering into trance by going deep into oneself. That seems to be what it means, but we're going to explore it more thoroughly and take a look at all this stuff. Now, I'm going to quote now from Wolfson, who's a wonderful scholar. Hereafter we'll cite him, Wolfson. This is his article called Yerida la Merkava. That means descent to the chariot. Typology of ecstasy and enthronement in ancient Jewish mysticism. And I'm just quoting you some parts of it. A problem that has plagued the minds of scholars for some time is the seemingly paradoxical way that certain of the texts, primarily the HEKHALOT Rabbati, and a fragment from the Cairo Genitza, which a copyist has conveniently called Hotam HaMerkava, the seal of the chariot, but which scholars name the Oziah text, refer to the ascent as a descent to the chariot, Yerida la Merkava. So the HEKHALOT, which the term means palaces, describes visions of ascents into heavenly palaces. In the 7th heaven, there are 7 palaces one has to go through and negotiate in order to finally attain the vision of the throne of God. This is a genre, the HEKHALOT literature is a genre of Jewish esoteric and revelatory texts produced sometime between late antiquity, possibly as early as the Talmudic era about 200 BC, although most of them run from about 80 to 100, the 2nd century at least, into the medieval period, and all up into the early Middle Ages. The genre overlaps with Merkaba or chariot literature concerning Ezekiel's chariot, so the two are sometimes referred to together as books of the palaces and the chariot. Many motifs of later Kabbalah are based on the HEKHALOT texts, and the HEKHALOT literature itself is based upon earlier sources, including traditions about heavenly ascents of Enoch found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Hebrew Bible pseudepigrapha. This is just something I'm quoting just from Wikipedia on the HEKHALOT literature to give us a little bit of an overview of these motifs. So why do texts after 1st century Rabbi Akiba, this is the HEKHALOT Zutarte, which details an ascent of Rabbi Akiba, why do these texts after that refer to the descenders of the chariot? And Rabbi Akiba, of course, was the greatest saint, Jewish saint of the end of the 1st, early 2nd century. And he was known as a rider of the chariot, as one who made these ascents, and did so successfully. He was able to ascend and descend, or that is to go up to the throne and come back and bring the information to people, the secret knowledge, whereas others who tried had suffered illness or death or so on. The HEKHALOT Rabbati which details the heavenly journey of Rabbi Ishmael, and the Masa Merkava, which is a collection of hymns recited by the descenders and heard during their ascent, are these texts that are quite detailed and refer to people as descending or descenders of the chariot. This heavenly journey of Ishmael is very complex. If you want to ever see the text, it's full of magical incantations and hymns that are sung. It's very liturgical. It's very much like the Greek magical papyri. So scholars have proposed various theories of what descent to the chariot means. The first theory, which was proposed by Bloch and later by Grunwald, his Apocalyptic, I give you the reference here, is that the current usage, the usage of that verb to descend in the HEKHALOT literature, at the time that the HEKHALOT literature was being written, meant to enter into, to fall into the trance of the Merkava experience. And that is something that I think is quite a legitimate theory and something that I would support. But there are other theories, and they also may be applicable in this case. The second theory is that the term Yerida, descent, in this context reflected the influence of the Song of Songs, which was a highly esoteric source for commentary and secret midrash of the Jewish mystics and the rabbis. In the Song of Songs, it says, I went down, and it's the same term, Yerida, to the nut orchard, which assumes that the nut symbolizes the chariot. Well, the chariot is symbolized as a nut by German Jewish pietists of the 12th and 13th centuries, and may underlie the graphical representations of the Merkaba, the chariot, as a three-dimensional Star of David. It looks like a sort of kind of nut. A third theory that's been proposed is that descent may be linguistically analogous to katabasis in the Greek magical papyri, designating the preparatory ritual for a mystic vision, as in the Mithras liturgy. Now, katabasis means to prepare. One prepares oneself to make the ascent. And of course, that was really important in order to go into the trance, or to try to go into the trance, to try to produce the trance, to have the experience. That descent may refer to this whole series of preparation. So let's take a look at this, how this was done in the Greek magical papyri for the Mithras liturgy. I should probably present the same kind of material as it's found in the ascents of Rabbi Ishmael, but it's very, very much comparable. It's very much the same. I would encourage you to Google Rabbi Ishmael and the Merkaba to get the text of these things, to see just how much it is like the magical liturgies. So these words here are intoned. E, A, ya, E, ow, O, Since it's impossible for me, and this is the text that we have in the Mithras liturgy, and this is the prayer that's being made. Since it is impossible for me, born mortal, to rise with the golden brightnesses of the immortal brilliance, Oi, Ayo, Ya, El, I, stand, O perishable nature of mortals, and at once keep me safe and sound. And that's the importance of the preparation is to keep one safe and sound to make the ascent and the descent. For I am the Son, and then it goes on with more intoning, I am, and I am, blah, blah, blah. It's very much like the Egyptian uh, petitions that are made as one finds in the Egyptian books of the dead. One identifies with Horus and Horus Harpocrates and so on. And then it goes on, draw in breath from the rays, drawing up 3 times as much as you can, and you will see yourself being lifted up and ascending to the height, so that you seem to be in mid-air. You will hear nothing, either of man or of any other living thing, nor in that hour will you see anything of mortal affairs on earth, but rather you will see all immortal things, the planets, rising into heaven, another setting. This is Marvin Meyer's translation, by the way, of the Mithras liturgy, parts of the Mithras liturgy. And so this is the kind of catabasis, this is kind of preparation was done for the ascent and the vision of the gods, and to generate a vision of the higher self, the golden self, the light body self, through this kind of liturgy, this kind of catabasis in the Mithras liturgy. And we find that Jewish magical traditions, which we find in the Sefer HaRatzim and many others, are almost identical with the Greek and Demotic and Egyptian and other Chaldean magical traditions with magical names and magical words. And we find this in the preparation for the HEKHALOT literature as well. And there's another theory about what descent to the chariot might mean. This 4th theory, Wolfson describes, is that the descent may be based on a midrashic passage in Exodus Rabbah concerning the Israelites who crossed the Red Sea. In that context, the Israelites are first called Yoredei Hayam, descenders to the sea, and afterwards Ola Hayam, ascenders from the sea. So one of the scholars, Halperin, is led to propose this passage as a possible source for the peculiar terminology Yored la Merkava, the descenders to the chariot, because of the association of the visions of the glory and the crossing of the sea. Indeed, in that very passage, the Israelites are further described as beholding the divine glory at sea. So Wolfson concludes that descent means entering into the chariot or the Merkaba and also safely exiting it. Rabbi Akiba, according to an alternative reading, entered safely and exited safely, or ascended safely and descended safely. That is to say, within the framework of HEKHALOT Rabbati, the expression indicates a successful and completed journey to the throne. One enters and afterwards exits safely. Interestingly enough, in the very first passage of HEKHALOT Rabbati, the expression enter safely and exit safely is used in conjunction with the mystical experience of contemplating the chariot. And this is, again, the material from Rabbi Ishmael, which is full of all kinds of intoned names and sacred items that have to be prepared and put on the left and put on the right and made an altar. It was very magical. Rabbi Ishmael said, "What are the songs that one who desires to behold the vision of the chariot to enter safely and exit safely must say?" So there are psalms that are sung, and this series of psalms are very important because it's part of a liturgy one goes through in order to prepare to possibly induce the experience of the ascent. The twofold process of Yerida, descent, equals entering, and Aliyah, ascent, is a technical way, says Wolfson, of referring to the vision of the chariot. Hence, in this case, as well as the Yerida la Merkava, the is followed by the en aliyah. So the descent into the chariot is followed by the aliyah, by the ascent that takes you up to the throne of God. So HEKHALOT literature becomes midrashic, not experiential. In other words, it becomes a sort of fictional description of the cosmology of heaven and earth and of God's invisible olamim and so on. The post-second century focus of the HEKHALOT narratives is a detailed description of the divine heavens rather than the vision of God or the transformation of the ascender or descender. As in Paul's case, for example, he was transformed into what he was. The term that's used by some of the scholars is he was angelificated, angelificated, made into like an angelic being as a prophet who has now been transformed through the ascent and now is able to bring back secret knowledge and Ratzim and so on. In other words, the focus is intended to provide a revelation of the divine worlds by one who's journeyed there and returned, much like Cicero's dream of Scipio. And I put on the right-hand side a sort of schematic graphic of Cicero's vision of the invisible heavens. In determining what might be mystical about Merkaba mysticism, scholars point to the ascent of the mystic to the divine throne in the seventh heaven, with the vision of God on his throne as the climax of the ascent. Yet, the reader who follows the long, convoluted, and in many cases fragmentary ascent accounts, narratives, hymns, and prayers, and so on in the HEKHALOT literature, is not rewarded with a description of God. Instead, he observes the mystic as he participates in the heavenly liturgy of the angels. And my comment, this is from the HEKHALOT literature and the origins of Jewish mysticism by Peter Schaffer. I'm going to hereafter refer to this particular reference as Schaffer. In other words, what he's saying here, he's pointing out, is that the ascender-descender is following a liturgical script of hymns, not having a trance or out-of-body experience, although he may succeed in inducing one. So he's basically, the HEKHALOT literature is not a record of one's divine ascent and having been changed by that, as, for example, the Corpus Hermeticum 13 or Tractate 6 that we find in Tractate 6 of Codex 6 of the Corpus Hermeticum, or that we find in Paul's journey to the third heaven, or in the ascent of Mary in the Gospel of Mary, and any of that sort of thing. Instead, he's simply following a recipe, a liturgy, singing hymns, reciting certain hymns, intoning divine names, setting up an altar in a certain kind of way, to perhaps succeed in inducing the ascent to the throne of God. But in fact, it's a liturgy that's being done at this point. So the pre-second century work of the chariot was experiential and mystical, like Paul's being caught up into the third heaven to receive secret gnosis or ratzim, which transformed him into a heavenly messenger, a malach, an angel, so to speak. It was prohibited in the first century, at the time of Yeshua and Paul and so on, to discuss Merkaba. I'm quoting now from the Babylonian Talmud. Ma'aseh Bereshit, that's the first chapter of Genesis, the creation story, which is considered to be highly esoteric and was, in Kabbalistic thought, was was developed into all kinds of magical usages. The Ma'aseh Bereshit must not be explained before two students. In other words, it could be explained before one student, just one's best and highest student. Nor the Ma'aseh Merkabah, which is the first chapter of Ezekiel, which is the basis for Merkabah mysticism, must not be explained before one student. In other words, you don't talk about it to anybody unless he be wise and understands it by himself. So Paul was not supposed to, by the rules that he understood as a student of Gamaliel and a rabbinical student himself, was not supposed to discuss any such mystical visions he himself had. So that's why he doesn't say, I had this. He says, I know a man who this happened to. But he's doing it for very obvious reasons in order to get creds for having made the ascent or having had the mystical experience, which counted as major creds for the early Gentile Christians and made him, was part of his credentials of being able to call himself an apostle. Now, Yeshua, out of all the disciples he had, and according to the descriptions we have in the New Testament, he had 70 really well-trained disciples who went in pairs to villages to go ahead and proclaim the Masor of Yeshua and to announce his coming to those villages. And then he had anywhere between 12 and 17 of the closest disciples who later were called in the New Testament the apostles. And of that small group, he only initiated a few. The only ones we really know of are Cephas, the name that he gave, the initiatic name he gave to Shimon, Simon Peter. He's called Petros in Greek from his initiatic name. And James and John, whom he called Boanerges, the voices of thunder, the powerful preachers. And Mary Magdala, the fortress of strength. Those four are the only ones that we can speculate were initiated by Yeshua in this way. Although there was supposed to be another one, according to the descriptions, that was going to be initiated right before Yeshua was seized and taken to trial. But now, later, after this century goes by, in the Tosefta Megillah, we get this interesting late century, second century comment that explains to us that the HEKHALOT mysteries, the HEKHALOT accounts, are not actually experiential. It says, many have expounded upon the Merkabah without ever seeing it. So that adds a little more fuel to the proof. So I think we can conclude that the later HEKHALOT literature was midrashic. It was not experiential. It was liturgical. It is only Enoch's transformation into the highest angel Metatron and Metatron's enthronement in third Enoch as the Yahweh HaKatan, the lesser Yahweh, the microprosopos, as it was later called, that can justifiably be termed what the scholars will refer to as angelification, transformation of the ascender into a divine kind of being who's enthroned. But the idea of Enoch or Metatron's transformation and enthronement on a throne in heaven next to God is a response, undoubtedly a response to the Christian Trinitarian claim that Jesus was elevated into heaven and sits on a throne next to the throne of God. Schaffer points this out. And why do we see that? Well, Third Enoch purports to have been written in the 2nd century, but its origins can only be traced to the 5th century. And you'll find that in Wikipedia is a good description of Third Enoch. So by the time Third Enoch is written, Enoch becomes the character or the process that is used in Jewish apologetic to counter the idea of Jesus, of Christ as the one who sits on the throne of God and has been transformed that way. Instead, it's Enoch who has become Metatron. So in the later HEKHALOT literature, the ascent-descent quote does not benefit or serve the needs of the mystic as an individual, as it would, for example, with Paul. Rather, it serves the needs of the earthly community, says Schaffer. The mystic is expected to return to his fellow Jews on earth and to assure them of God's continuous love for his people after the destruction of the Second Temple. So this is the critical event, the destruction of the Second Temple, where this kind of experience becomes liturgical, and it becomes a way of ensuring that the Jewish people are being cared for by Yahweh. So the ultimate message, says Schaffer, much of the HEKHALOT literature, is that God still cares for his people of Israel. In the 1st century, it was forbidden to discuss Genesis 1st chapter and Ezekiel 1st chapter because the rabbis considered exegesis of these passages to be an esoteric discipline that could not be spoken about and could not be made public. They were not opposed to the heavenly journey of some mystics like Akiba, who was a great hero to them, his journey to the divine throne, but they warned of the dangers of the experience. But in post-temple, 2nd century rabbinic Judaism, midrashic commentaries and accounts of, quote, ascenders, descenders to the throne of God, i.e., fictional accounts of journeys through the HEKHALOT, multiplied throughout the centuries. These non-experiential fictional accounts continued well into the medieval period in Judaism. So that's kind of the long path and trail of Merkaba mysticism from the earliest post-exilic times to the medieval period and the HEKHALOT accounts. This is the end of the presentation.